This is lecture 18 in the ABCs of Communism series, and the subject matter today is the fight for communism in Venezuela. This is going to be chapter 33 in next year's ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2015 edition, and it reminds me that Amazon says they can take pre-orders now beginning 3 months ahead of time. So if you want to replace your 2014 edition with this one, 2015 edition, you could probably do it that route, or if you just want to get, this is a 900-page book now, so for $2.99 you may want to just spring for keep the 2014 edition and order the 2015 edition. However you want to do it, the details of what we're going to be going through today are all in that chapter, and they are fairly extensive details because now we're in South America for the first time, and that means we are talking about a totally separate origin. Well, not totally separate, but a largely separate origin for the domesticated animals and plants of South America as compared to those of Mesoamerica and North America. So we're going to start with the primitive communist period as it reaches the agricultural revolution in South America overall. Now, there are two geographical regions in South America which are important with regard to the agricultural revolution. The first is the Central Andes, where you have the domestication of potatoes and some wild grains going on by 10,000 years ago. The second is the Amazon basin, where you have the domestication of various tuberous plants such as potatoes and cassava. Cassava you're probably not familiar with, but that's what South Americans make manioc out of, which is an important, it's almost equivalent to potatoes in many ways, an important source of carbohydrates. Up here we get it mostly in the form of pudding or some kind of thickener, but not very widely used in North America, but it's very important in South America. So by 8,000 years ago you have those plants, that is the cassava being, first there were potatoes around 10,000 years ago, and then by 8,000 years ago you have the cassava plants. By 7,500 years ago there's a new grain. It's not technically a grass, it's actually a chenopod called quinoa, Q-U-I-N-O-A, which is domesticated and makes its way into the highlands and this eventually becomes a pretty important staple in Peru in the highlands and in Bolivia in the highlands. Okay, so these are the beginnings of domestication, and in the first couple pages of that chapter I'll give you a list of every single domesticated plant, and there's several pages of discussion as to its origins. We don't need to go into all of that right now because our objective here is to get up to the point at which we have a modern period beginning in the actual fight for communism as we've seen it develop in the years of Hugo Chavez. Well, the first Spaniards arrived on the coast of Venezuela after it had gone through not only this primitive communist period, but also after it had gone through the transition to class society. So we had tribal agriculture and simple chiefdoms and advanced theocratic chiefdoms throughout the Central Andes. When Columbus arrived on the Spanish coast in 1498, on the Venezuelan coast in 1498, that was his the only time he stopped in South America at all, and that was his third trip. So, but what it did do, just in that little bit of limited contact he had, he was able to discover that the entire Venezuelan coastal region of America was inhabited by people of what we call Bando. There were many islands where natives were really big into diving for pearls and harvesting pearls in a variety of ways, and pearls were something that the Spanish had already identified as a valuable stone, and also one that was light enough and small enough they could carry around and use as money. So what this did, the combination of the fact that Columbus realized that these people had gold and pearls was enough to get the rumor started back in the Caribbean islands, where by this time you have, that is by 1492 was the first voyage, 1498 is the third voyage. The word has spread throughout Europe that if you're a young man and you have no future whatsoever back home, then maybe you should give the New World a try, because up there it's up for grabs, and whatever you can grow, you can keep. So all kinds of people had headed out of this class, people possessed back home, had headed to the Caribbean islands, and they were just hanging around waiting for something. When the Columbus report came back from northern South America about the pearls on top of the gold, well, that was enough to get them rushing around. And so throughout the 1500s, there was an ongoing struggle for the Spaniards to occupy the Venezuelan coast for a variety of reasons. Part of it was just looting, part of it was getting slave labor to run mines with, part of it was harvesting pearls. And at the same time, there were a few individuals who had enough money and enough sense to realize that they could build further inland a latifundia or an hacienda kind of situation, similar to what they had dreamed about having back in New Spain, but which had been denied them. I mean, back in Spain originally, which had been denied them. I'll just mention that I was fortunate when I started my research in archaeology that I got to Calgary at the exact same time that Dr. McNeish had just finished up his work in the Tehuacan Valley of Mexico, which we talked a little bit about in an earlier lecture here, and now was deeply involved in doing the same thing in the Ayacucho Valley of Peru. Now you say, well, Peru's quite a ways from Venezuela. It is, but what you want to realize is that the entire Andean mountain chain of South America, it constitutes one culture area in a certain sense. And the very center of that, what we call the Central Andes, is where you have the Ayacucho Valley, and there we have the anchor archaeological sequence for the last 20,000 years. We know that people were hunting and gathering and doing pretty much what hunters and gatherers do everywhere, from about 22,000 years ago to around 10,000 years ago, when they began to make the transition into tribal agriculture, and from there in Ayacucho they made the transition to simple chiefdoms, advanced theocratic chiefdoms. We saw the origin of the state and the origin of religion, and then the beginning not just of state kingdoms, but of state empires. Okay, now, Venezuela is just the northern hook of this Andean process. So whatever happens in Venezuela, whatever happens in the Central Andes is quickly reflected in Venezuela. One other thing I want to mention here is that when I was in graduate school, we still didn't know very much about connections between Mesoamerica and the Central Andes, and I think most of us were looking at independent invention of just about everything, possibly including corn, maize, in South America. But what's happened since then is we've filled out the archaeological record in the last 50 years, and we can see that the genetic nature of the corn that we find in Ayacucho is exactly the same as the genetic nature of the corn that we find in the Tehuacan Valley. That cannot be the product of independent invention. Because of its identicality, it has to be a process of diffusion. So we can probably fix the transition, the emergence of corn in South America from Mesoamerica around 4,500 years ago. That tells us a whole bunch of things about contact. First of all, to get from the highlands of the Mesoamerican area in the Tehuacan Valley around the state of Puebla, all the way down to the highlands of Ayacucho, which is in the central part of Peru in the Central Andes, at roughly the same time, means that there had to be a really enormous amount of traffic going back and forth between these two centers as early as 4,500 years ago, and earlier than that, for that matter. So that's something that's new that we have learned in the last half century. But other than that, the anchor sequence for Ayacucho should be seen as the anchor sequence for the entire Central Andean region. Likewise, the anchor sequence for the Amazonian region of Brazil and the adjacent parts of the countries that border on Brazil is also something new that's been coming about. And we know that by 8,000 years ago, the basic domesticates from the Amazon, such as cassava, had already been domesticated out in west central Brazil. And so that was moving up north into Venezuela as well as east into what's contemporary Peru. All right, with those comments, let me move on for a moment to just give you a couple examples of the very earliest potatoes in the that we can identify as clear-cut potatoes in the anchor sequence for Ayacucho come in around 10,000 years ago. The same is true for beans about 10,000 years ago. By 8,000 years ago, we have cassava coming in from the Amazon. By 7,500 years ago, we have quinoa being domesticated in the highlands of Bolivia and Peru. By 6,000 years ago, chili peppers, cotton, then 5,000 years ago, coca, sweet potato by 4,500 years ago, and tobacco by 3,000 years ago. Now, I have printed a considerable amount of data from pages 3 through 5 about the botanical history of both the tropical lowlands and the central Andean highlands. I'm going to skip over all that because that's going to be mainly of interest to those of you in archaeology or doing studies on the spread of domesticated New World plants, to the archaeology of Venezuela proper. Now, the very earliest stone tool complex in Venezuela comes around 15 to 20,000 years ago at a site called El Hobo. These are bipoints, that is, they're laurel leaf shaped and they have points on each end. This is one of the three early man traditions in the New World. The other is Clovis, and still another, the fluted or the fish-tailed points that spread from the tip of South America up the west coast of South America. These leaf-shaped points spread from this El Hobo site on the Venezuelan coast all the way up into the New World, up into North America. And then we have the fluted point tradition that seems to start at its earliest out in the U.S. Southwest, then spreads eastward and northward as these tools get younger. So there are these three early traditions, one of which is this bipoint laurel leaf projectile point culture, which we associate with its earliest dates of El Hobo. And certainly by 15,000 years ago, those tools are well established there. These people were hunting big game for their time, including the giant ground sloth and several other animals that were very large, and we don't really have any living representatives of them today, but that's the kind of lifestyle they had. We don't have a complete sequence for Venezuela proper, as we have for Mexico in its Tehuacan Valley or Peru in its Ayacucho Basin. But since we have both of those anchor sequences to the south and north, and we have hit and miss sequences of relative degrees of sophistication in terms of how they've been reported in Venezuela, we can put together a reasonably good picture of what was happening there. We know that by the time the Spaniards arrived, that is this Christopher Columbus group and the ones that followed him in there, by that time Venezuela seems to have had in its national territory, what is today its national territory, about 1 million people. So it was pretty well populated at that time. Now, the most advanced stage for any society is its advanced theocratic chiefdom stage. So what do we have in Venezuela that corresponds to that, and how much sooner prior to the arrival of Spanish feudalism did it exist? Well, we have an advanced theocratic chiefdom called El Gabon. It's in the state of Barinas, Venezuela, which is an important oil state when you look on your map. This advanced theocratic chiefdom lasted for 500 years, beginning around AD 500, lasted until AD 1000. So it was over with 500 years prior to the time that the Spanish arrived on the coast. This state features every environmental zone from high alpine to grasslands and the coastal wet lowlands. Many rivers dissect the Barinas, and in a phrase, it's a perfect location for the complete transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. Two have occurred, and it may be here that in the future an anchor sequence similar to that we have for Tehuacan and Ayacucho will be built. So for any of you amateur budding archaeologists are thinking about following in my footsteps, I would suggest that you consider that marine estate working from El Gavon, which is fairly close to the coast, back into the mountains, looking for caves where you could find the kinds of conditions that would allow for the preservation of the materials we need to build a 10,000 or 15 or 20,000 year history. For the moment, two archaeologists named Charles Spencer and Elsa Redmond began to tackle this question of how the chiefdoms evolved in Barinas in 1983, and their focus was on the savanna grasslands environmental zone of the high plains, what are called llanos, that's L-L-A-N-O-S, and the higher subalpine Piedmont. These researchers conducted a survey that found 103 sites of this late chiefdom period they call late El Gavon. These sites were found to contain 3 levels within the social organization of a single chiefdom. The largest site is the central one, and this is where the most important people of the highest ranks would have lived and carried on their work. That was excavated in 1988. It's 33 hectares in area, so that's pretty big. And it's classified as a first-tier advanced theocratic chiefdom state. And it was the center around, there were 5 lesser second-tier sites. And further out, there were 26 village sites, 36 third-tier sites, which were mainly made up of people who did all of the work in the agricultural fields. And the main site of the El Gavon Advanced Theocratic Chiefdom we're talking about, the big site, was fortified with earthworks and palisades, and it featured a central plaza flanked by 2 lesser mounds. You wouldn't do this unless you were anticipating a violent attack, either by an enemy advanced theocratic chiefdom or by somebody within your own ranks. I suspect that originally it was because of competition from other similarly situated chiefdoms. But there's reason to believe, by the nature of the violence when 1000 AD comes about, that brought about the collapse of this El Gavon chiefdom, that this was a class war. For the same reasons that we see advanced theocratic chiefdoms collapsing in many places everywhere else in the world, which is rank differentiation, some kind of environmental stress, for example, or some kind of social stress, brings about a situation where you have a conflict between the mass of the producers out in these third-tier site villages and the leadership. So if the state does not emerge, then, that is, if armed force in the hands of the rulers here in the center does not emerge, then there's no way they can prevent social dissolution. If it does emerge, but it's insufficient for whatever reason, that may still also lead to social dissolution. So we do know that not every advanced theocratic chiefdom where the state arose collapsed, but we know that some of them survived and went on. Well, the other thing about this main site where the wealthiest people lived is that it had pavement roads surrounding it and within it. Now this certainly is not unusual. In the U.S. Southwest, there's a road system that led up to Pueblo Bonito, for example, and we have seen it partially reconstructed, not archaeologically so much as has been done by various kinds of surveys and photographic mapping. So it seems to be normal for many of these advanced theocratic chiefdoms to get to the stage where they're really involved in monumental architecture, and not just for the purpose of fooling the masses and building some kind of an impressive temple, but also because it's accelerating the efficiency of their trade with paved roads, for example. At any rate, there's a 35-hectare system of drained farmlands and a third-tier level village site where 2 harvests a year were being extracted. Now we know from the graves where we find mass graves indicating lots of people killed at one time that there was warfare going on, and that's probably what brought this collapse about in around 1000 AD. We know that this El Gavon chiefdom was in contact with societies far away in the Venezuelan Andes, and still others from coastal sites far away, because we find artifacts here that come from those places. So we can even find roads or trails that are marked by rock art that lead from this El Gaván site to places far away in South America. Well, by the time that Columbus got there in 1498, 500 years after the collapse of El Gaván, what he found there was lots of pearls, and that immediately, as I've already mentioned, brought in a whole bunch of guys whose only interest were in stealing all these pearls from the natives and enslaving as many of them as possible to use it as forced labor in mines. And this was mostly what happened in the 1500s in Venezuela, was a bunch of looters hanging around with a bunch of ronin. Ronin is a Japanese term for an unemployed knight. So we have this phenomenon, however, in many parts of the feudal world, not just in Japan. So if you have somebody that can't get a job back home as a knight working for somebody, he signs up and goes to Cuba or Hispaniola, hooks up with somebody there like Cortez, and then goes out to cut himself out of hacienda of his own someplace in the New World with Indian slave labor. That's what we call ronin. These other guys are just showing up as kind of like hands on a pirate ship. And but the two of them are living together. They're hanging out in the same bars, or running around the part of the Venezuelan coast. And so the ronin will have some cannon fodder when the time comes. Well, you know, you stop and think sometimes that they could have done this a lot easier if they had had a different policy about how to deal with the Indians, but they didn't. You can kind of count on a conquistador Spaniard to be a conquistador Spaniard. And the consequence of that, as far as the natives were concerned, is that the Spaniards were as mean to the villagers as their bosses had been back home, probably meaner. And so they kept forcing these villagers onto the side of the theocrats and the emerging bosses with state power in their hands, and that actually reacted against them. Another thing that changed the situation in Venezuela was, for the first time, Germany as a country gets involved in Venezuela, because the Spanish king in 1528 sold his interests, or part of his interests, in Venezuela to the Weser Bank of Augsburg, or the banking family, to settle his debts. What is now called the Gulf of Venezuela was then called Little Venice, and that became corrupted into Venezuela instead of Venezuelita by the Spanish, and that's how Venezuela got its name. But the important thing here is not so much the name as the fact that in 1528, with the Germans' bank now owning what is a large part of that Maracaibo Basin, the flood of Germans who had, if you thought the Spanish poor white trash had very little hope back home in Siberia, the Germans had even less. So now they can get on a boat, come over to Venezuela, and they have a kind of a legal status to be there. And a few thousand Europeans showed up, of German background, within a few years, so that by the mid-1500s, the Spanish Europeans were fighting against the German Europeans. Then there was the fight between all of these entrepreneurial looters on the coast and a few individuals who had the idea of creating Iberian latifundias out in the high plains of Venezuela. Now this is what you want to start thinking about right now. I should have a map, but I don't have it to show you today. But if you have a map, take a look at northern South America, and you'll see that all of this area that we call Colombia and Venezuela, just taking those two countries, all of that at this time is being dealt with by Spain as one entity. So that area in the middle, which you can see probably is low lying, are called the plains, Los Llanos. There's the high plains, and there's the low plains. Generally speaking, these plains are underwater 9 months out of the year. Last time I was there, 20 odd years ago, I remember this very well because I was down there on a trip having to do with oil exploration, and I had an office in Bogota, and we would drive from there to the airport, which wasn't too far away, then take a little four-seater plane out to visit those parts of the plains that we wanted to look at that time, which was in the dry season, that is the 3 months of the year when the plains are not underwater. So we had a good chance to take a look at that area. Now the biggest problem for oil exploration there, as you might imagine, is that you, for 9 months out of the year, for most of the plains, you can't do anything there. So whatever you're going to build in the way of oil platforms and so on, you're going to be drilling in what are essentially inland waters. You want to build it during those 3 months where everything is dry, and then get ready to have about 10 feet of water on the ground. Well, there's an area right next to that leading into the mountains, geographically speaking, which is called Llanos Altos, so high plains. And here you could have cattle and horses all year round. So what we had developing by the 1600s in Venezuela was a class of individual Spaniards who had built up big Iberian-style latifundias in this high plains area. So they could survive all year round. And from that point on, we're taking a look at the political evolution of Venezuela. It starts on page 9 of this chapter in your 2015 textbook. And I'm not going to go through all of that political evolution except to say that for quite a few years, about 200 years, from say 1521 to 1721 to 1821, that's 300 years, you have a period of essentially social stagnation. No new working classes coming into existence because no real factories are being built anywhere in Venezuela. The old system of peonage labor that they inherited from the early states is now simply converted into Spanish overseers. That political division of this whole new area takes on a whole bunch of names, and I have listed the top 10 cities of New Granada, which is one of the names that this area of northern South America had for a while. And I've also given you a periodization chart for emerging Colombia and Venezuela. And we'll let that take us up to 1821. What we're really going to be taking a look at is the man named Simón Bolívar. Hugo Chavez has reincarnated him in more recent times with his Bolivarian Revolution. Simón Bolívar was born in 1783 and he died in 1830. But he was, in his time, exactly the right man, in exactly the right time, at exactly the right place. He came from pure white Spanish parents who had emigrated from the Basque region of Spain. He was born in Venezuela, which then makes him by definition a Creole. A Creole is just a Spaniard that's never been to Spain, one that's born in the New World. And for most of them, they didn't care whether they went back or not. This was a class that had ruled Venezuela for as far as they could see forever, but of course they hadn't been forever. They had from their arrival in 1589, when we're talking about Bolivar's parents, was still a province of New Spain, and from the New Kingdom of Granada through the succeeding Viceroyalty of New Granada, their family's wealth came from latifundias, from their gold, silver, and copper mines, which of course were all run by slave labor. Now, Simón Bolívar in many ways is like Thomas Jefferson. His father, Jefferson's father, was from the overseer class, and Jefferson admired him because he was like an NCO in the army. He was the one that got all the work done and knew all of the things that we would expect master mechanics, for example, to know today. Bolívar's father was a similar background. He had a latifundia, and he also had been a professor and headmaster of the military academy in Caracas. At any rate, Simon was born in 1783. Stop and think. 2 years after George Washington's victory at Yorktown, and 6 years before the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. Now, well, I think you can see right there that his childhood then is at precisely the time of the North American and French revolutions. He later said that the only mother he ever knew was a slave woman who took care of him in these years, whose name was Hippolyta. At any rate, and of course she was black. He was homeschooled there at home, which was not unusual among wealthy people in the Caracas set, and that exposed him to what there was of intellectual elite within Caracas. In 1808, now you'll remember that Bonaparte seized Spain, and he deposed the old monarchy and made his brother Joseph king of Spain. Spain fell into civil war. You know, we've seen all of these stories about the Spanish Civil War on television in recent years as a part of a series of, I forgot the name of it now. But at any rate, so while Spain went into civil war, so did the overseas provinces of Spain go into civil war. Now, in 1897, the last of Simón Bolívar's teachers had to flee from Caracas for political reasons. And so Bolívar then was sent to high school and the military academy, the same one where his father had been headmaster. Oh, his father had been dead 12 years by this time, but that was the background. There he learned military strategy and armaments. And after graduation, Bolívar rounded out his education by traveling to Mexico and Europe. While in Madrid, he met Maria Teresa Rodriguez del Toro y Alaiza, a woman from a famous Caracas family, his own age, and he married her in 1802. The two of them then returned to Caracas, but tragedy struck and she died 8 months after their return. Grief-stricken, Simón Bolívar in 1804 returned again to Europe, taking up residence this time in France. And there he was to witness the Paris coronation of Napoleon Bonaparte as Emperor of France and everything French. That happened in 1807. It was the event of the new century, where Napoleon crowned himself. Bolívar then returned to Venezuela that same year and leaped into the political arena. Well, 1810, the Venezuelan armed forces staged a coup against the Spanish colonial authorities, and they set up a military Supreme Junta of Caracas to take command of all government functions. They sent their own diplomatic mission to the United Kingdom to get assistance from the UK in its struggle against Spain, and specifically to get a man named Francisco de Miranda to return to Venezuela and take command of the army, which had now seized power in Caracas. To carry out this job, they sent Simón Bolívar and 2 other officers. And to make a long story short, those 2 were successful. They convinced Miranda, was his name, to come back, and he did in 1811. And there he immediately formed a kind of Sons of Liberty, as the North Americans had, that he called the Patriotic Society. And this is only in months after he returned. They called a Congress on July 15th. They declared Venezuela's independence from Spain. They declared Venezuela to be a republic. They adopted the French tricolor as their flag. And Miranda took command of the republic's army, that is the Junta's army. Bolívar came along in the army as a staff Republican colonel. Now, here's where things start getting really interesting in terms of politics. The Spanish army it's still in Caracas, or still in Venezuela, began to divide. Some of them were going to support the new junta government, some of them were going to support the old royalist government. And Venezuela went right into civil war. By 1812, a year later, the Patriotic Army had suffered many defeats. This is the army under General Miranda. Miranda had secretly come to an agreement with the Spanish that he would surrender. Bolivar and his officers found out about this agreement before Miranda could carry out his betrayal. They arrested him, took him to the Spanish authorities, and turned him over to them. And they were given safe conduct out of the country. That was the end of Miranda, because the Spaniards took him back to Cadiz, put him in jail, and he died there in 1813. Well, once he got out of there, he began to organize a new army to come back and help him liberate the rest of South America. And I'll kind of make a long story short here. What really happened for him was that he won 3 battles in 1813, one right after the other, in the cities of Trujillo, Merida, and finally Caracas. Then, one of these big warlords out there in the plains, who didn't like this particular brand that Bolivar was bringing back, revolted against him in 1814. This forced Bolivar again to leave the country. This time he went to Jamaica and then to Haiti. And in Haiti, there was a new slave government, that is, a new black government of former slaves who had fought the Bonapartists and kicked them out. But this man Pétion, who was president now of Haiti, he knew that Bonaparte will be back as soon as he can do it, because there's just too much money involved in slave labor in Haiti, in sugarcane. So the Frenchman will be back. So he had to think down the road. Showing up here is Simon Bolivar, who says, I want to kick the Spanish, which now includes the French, out of all of South America, and I need your help. So this Pétion in Haiti agreed to give him a 50,000-man army to take back to northern South America, which he did. So in 1814, he came back and began a fight against these guys working out of the Llanos. We'll skip up to 1821, when Bolivar wins that fight and expels the Spanish from Venezuela altogether. But he's also declared war against Spain, and to the degree that France is still involved, in 1821 against all of Spanish control in Latin America. Well, they've already lost New Spain and Cuba. Well, they haven't quite lost Cuba yet. They'll hold on to that for quite a long time. But they have also lost Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, what's now Panama, and the only place they have left is Ecuador and Peru. So in 1821, at Carabobo, the Spanish get kicked out of Venezuela altogether. Then Bolivar is made president of what was then called Gran Colombia, but we'll just think of it as Venezuela. And he went next to Quito, where he fought the remaining Spanish army in Ecuador and defeated them on May 24th, 1822. Then 2 days later, he makes it somehow. I don't know how they did it that fast back in those days, because it's not an easy trip even today. But 2 days later, he makes it all the way from Quito to Guayaquil, which is down on the coast. And there he meets with the Argentine military man named San Martin. And they together put together a plan to expel the Spanish from Peru, that which is the last place that the Spanish have been occupied. And in 2 days they put together that military plan, and they sent a general named Sucre to defeat the Spanish, whose last military stand is going to be in the Ayacucho Valley. And that they did in 1824 in December at the Battle of Ayacucho. And the following year, Peru is independent, as is Bolivia. Bolivia is interesting because 1825, August 6th, is its date of independence, and it's a country named after Simon Bolivar himself, making him perhaps the only man in history up until that time, at any rate, to have a nation named after him. Many years later, Cecil Rhodes would name what's today called Zimbabwe, would name Rhodesia after himself. That's the only other country I can think of right offhand where somebody's had a country named after themselves. By the way, at one time I thought that the Rhodes Scholarship that Cecil Rhodes set up had some kind of academic requirements for it, but in the Christmas season of 1960 I was in Rome partying at a restaurant bar combo on Via Veneto. I met an American woman there who was on a Rhodes Scholarship, and I can tell you that after my several days with her, I can tell you that there's no academic excellence required whatsoever to get a Rhodes Scholarship. Now, fundamentally, it's a class thing. You come from the right class or the class that they have picked that's going to be in service to them, and then it's a political appointment that you get after that, for what it's worth. Anyway, in the aftermath of what happened in South America, now with the liberation by 1825, the getting rid of the Spanish altogether, from 1830 to 1908, the landed aristocratic families of Creole descent ruled among themselves, and they governed Venezuela through a succession of strongman presidents, usually former generals, and these guys they called caudillos. Sometimes they call them guerrillas, but not like the guerrilla of Che Guevara guerrilla warfare type, but like the guerrilla of the zoo type, because the idea was that these guys are so dumb and brutal, that's the only way they can hold on to power. So whether you want to call them caudillos or guerrillas, it doesn't matter to me, but if you see those names in the literature, you'll know what we're talking about. A big, strong thug whose only solution for every problem is brute force, and usually an excessive amount of that. Okay, now, we have been following oil as a key to understanding the development of capitalism in this entire book, and we're going to continue to do that in South America, because nowhere is that more appropriate than in the study of the transition to capitalism in Venezuela and in the understanding of how Venezuelan capitalism grew in the 20th century. Now, you know, everywhere in the world that we know about the earliest uses of oil, it comes from seeps of heavy oil asphalt types on the surface, and people everywhere used it to caulk things, used it as a grease for certain kinds of wheels. Byproducts of it were used for illumination, and the same thing is true in Spain. What barrel of oil was even sent to King Charles V in 1539 from Venezuela for use in treating his gout. But whether that had any success or not, I don't know. But what you can see is that it's not really a great important item, but it is important for heavy asphalt to caulk ships and lighter oil fractions as gun oil. So one of the things that happened in the meetings between San Martin and Bolivar that led up to the Battle of Ayacucho was an agreement to nationalize oil in South America. Anyway, Simón Bolivar nationalized oil in Venezuela as part of his decree on mining made from Quito, Ecuador, and this concept was included in his talks 2 months later with Jose de San Martin, as I just mentioned, over the finalization of the new Central Andes, which was to follow their ultimate victory. And, well, the global demand for oil, which we've already reviewed, led to Venezuela's reserves being tapped at the end of the 1800s. The first drilling rig imported from the United States to work in Venezuela was brought down from Pennsylvania in 1880, and it was one of these cable drilling rigs like you see in the movie There Will Be Blood that I've recommended to you before. Now, you recall that we were talking about the foreigners in Mexico being worried about being nationalized, and that they had been trying, that the Americans and British had been trying to get out of Mexico, and they had been looking around for some place that they thought of as more important, safer than what they considered to be Bolshevik Mexico. So it wasn't really, of course, but it was on the verge. It could have been Bolshevik Mexico. They were right about that. They were right to look for oil elsewhere. Well, So they had looked in Venezuela, and here they'd had considerable luck. Now they had installed a general that they particularly liked, named Juan Vicente Gomez, and he would be president of Venezuela for 27 years. He gave them everything they wanted around Lake Maracaibo. He didn't give it to them, he sold it to them, and he was more successful at this than most Latin American presidents because he had a lot more to sell. And he knew how to squeeze his fair share out of these guys. He gave one Brit representative a contract in 1809, took it back in 1810 for another. They gave him a better cut. In 1913, Gomez gave Royal Dutch Shell, via a local subsidiary that they had established, a really sweet deal on Lake Maracaibo exploration and recovery. Now these guys, these foreign capitalists, began to strike it big. Royal Dutch Shell made a huge strike via their Latin American subsidiary called Caribbean Petroleum at Sumaque 1 on April 5th, 1914. And then in 1914 they also revealed an entire huge oil field at Mene Grande in the Maracaibo Basin. And if you look on your map, you can see Maracaibo Basin is a big area with a big bay, and you could probably get the impression from all of the letters that are running around there that it's a site of intense industrial activity, which it is. Last time I was there was on the same trip I mentioned to you before, where we'd gone up to the Venezuelan-Colombian border. You couldn't tell any bit of difference between Houston offshore and Maracaibo offshore. It was exactly the same kind of stuff. Anyway, so the oil business was big in Venezuela before the First World War. There were two brand new rigs in there in the after 1810 that were rotary drilling type, and these hit it big too. Now the market was getting bigger and firmer for oil worldwide because of the war itself. The Americans sent over 50,000 gasoline-powered vehicles, land vehicles and airplanes, to Europe as part of that effort. All of this stuff needed oil and gasoline. So there was a real steady flow of oil from Venezuela, and that meant flow of cash back into Venezuela, beginning with the First World War, and it was made secure during the course of the war. By the end of 1917, the very first refining operations began in Venezuela at a place called San Lorenzo. That refinery was originally intended to process the Mene Grande field production we just mentioned. The first exports of Venezuelan oil were done by Royal Dutch Shell out of that San Lorenzo terminal at the end of 1917. 1 year later, by the end of 1918, petroleum appearing on Venezuelan export statistics was 21,194 metric tons. Now, a metric ton, for those of you who may not know, is just a little over 7 barrels at 42 gallons per barrel. In other words, a little over 7 barrels per ton. A metric ton is 1,000 kilograms. A kilogram is 2.2 pounds. So generally speaking, one can multiply the number of metric tons by 7 to get the number of barrels and then round that upwards. So in this case, 21,194 metric tons times 7 rounded up would give 150,000 barrels exported from Venezuela by the end of 1918. That doesn't sound like a lot today, but at the time it made Venezuela the number 4 oil producer in the world. 2 more wells came in 1922 around Lake Maracaibo. And what we had now developing was a real industrial working class. So now it's time to take a look at how is that industrial working class being organized by the Communist International. That party officially kicks off in Venezuela in 1931, but its earliest formation is actually in Mexico in 1926. The Venezuelan comrades took their inspiration from what the Mexican Communist Party was doing, and they were specifically told, encouraged by their Mexican comrades, to accept the task given to them by the Comintern under Michael Borodin that we started talking about in Lecture 30 on Mexico, namely that the Mexican Communist Party should take the lead in formation of communist parties throughout Latin America. And the Venezuelans were inspired by what was happening that year, 1926, in Cuba. And also, at any rate, in 1926, they now created their own shell organization called the Venezuelan Revolutionary Party. They entered politics in their home country in 1929 in open rebellion against the military dictatorship of General Gomez. Now, the Venezuelan communists received official recognition from the Communist International in 1931 and changed their name to Communist Party of Venezuela. And then it elected its first leaders. The names won't mean anything to you now, so we won't worry about that. But the important thing is Venezuelans who came to Mexico after Borodin left at the end of 1919 now meet the Mexican communists who have been given the task. And in the years from 1920 to 1926, they are busy proselytizing to every bunch of foreign left-wingers that say they want to be communists that are coming to Mexico City. When I made my first trip to Mexico City in 1962, I was en route to Cuba with a letter of invitation from Juan Marinello, who was a longtime communist leader in Cuba. We mentioned in when we talked about Chapter 31 in previous lectures. These guys were still coming from everywhere in Latin America. By this time, Mexico City had become kind of a place where a Spanish-speaking person could escape to and expect to get no trouble from the government. As long as you didn't cause the government any trouble specifically while you were there, they were happy to have you. Remember, most of these people come in there with a certain amount of money, so it's not like guys hitting the border up here in the States who have nothing and are coming to work in a car wash. These intellectuals that come from abroad, they have family connections. They have money in their pocket, more or less, or they could have money in their pocket when they get here. And at any rate, they won't have any trouble supporting themselves because they have professions. Like Che Guevara showed up as a medical doctor. Right away he goes to work. This was normal when I got there in '62. You would go to one place for somebody that you had met, like Carlos Prieto, and he would introduce you to 20 other people that came from South America, North America, Europe. Everybody is on the run in one way or another, and everybody has a story to tell about why they're in Mexico and what's going on. So this is the kind of situation that these Venezuelans who thought they wanted to be communists had found themselves in the years from 1921 to 1926, that 5-year period. They had formed their initial revolutionary party there. They had made their application to the Comintern to become an officially recognized Communist Party for Venezuela, and they had gone back to Venezuela to start organizing real workers in real strike actions. By 1931, the Comintern did recognize them, and they were off and running. Now, good old General Gomez is what he was called in Wall Street, had 2 families by mistresses that he never formally married, all of whom were direct beneficiaries of massive corruption that General Gomez ran out of his office. And he lasted for 27 years until he died at the trough on December 17th, 1935. If you ever saw that movie, Moon over Parador, this is about as close to that situation as I can imagine. And the dictator in that movie finally dies of too many punos, or I think here in Venezuela they said too many margaritas. But at any rate, he was succeeded by another man named Lopez Contreras, who was just a high-ranking Gomez gangster, had been war minister since 1931, and he would last until 1941. Now, in 1941, FDR wanted a person in charge of Venezuelan oil that was more competent than this idiot Contreras. And the military intelligence had established a relationship with the Venezuelan communists. The 2 of them agreed that it would be a good idea to put a more progressive man and a technocrat, somebody that actually knew what he was doing, in command of Venezuela. So they agreed on a man named Mendita Angarita, and in June 21st of 41, which you will notice is the same day that the Soviet Union was attacked, they replaced this Contreras government with their own man. Now, he lasted until October 18th, 1945. You'll notice that October 18th that's just all of the month of May, June, July, August, September. 5.5 months later, the Americans removed him, and they announced that their new leader was going to be Romulo Bentoncourt as interim president. In 1947, the interim government conducted elections which that party, Democratic Action, won, but with a different man, elected as the AD candidate. Well, I mentioned this because we have already gone over how Harry Truman reversed FDR's entire foreign policy within a couple of weeks of coming to office. This is a good example. 5.5 months after Truman becomes president, we have this situation, and after the end of the war, with the red flag over the bombed-out Reichstag building on May 1st, we have the Americans getting rid of this Venezuelan government altogether because, as far as they're concerned, it's way too progressive, and it has communists in it. So they get rid of it with Bentoncourt. But they think he's not reactionary enough. They want somebody who's a real fascist in their own image. And so they get rid of him. And because they're unhappy with those 1947 election results. So a year later, November 24th, 48, they come up with General Marcos Perez Jimenez. Now, Jimenez went immediately down the road of personal enrichment, following the playbook of Cuba's Fulgencio Batista. He was exactly the same thing as Batista at exactly the same time. So it's obvious that Washington is happy with what they have been achieving in Guatemala, Cuba, and now Venezuela, and they have no intention of changing. Even though anybody with common sense would see that this kind of a fascist regime is doomed from the beginning because it's stealing from everybody, not just poor people, it's stealing from all the wealthy people too. And that isn't going to last. At any rate, since 1931, the Venezuelan communists had a very active educational program. So they were able to convince the nation that all of this liberal, what we call neoliberal nonsense today, that was being spewed out about why they were having economic problems in Venezuela was just that, and that the real problem was the iron law of capitalist relations that Marx had described so many years ago in Volume 1 of Capital. So, given that, the Jimenez regime was doomed, I think, to destruction in the long run. Now, in 1948, this Jimenez regime comes to power and not only gets rid of the communist threat within the country, as far as Washington is concerned, but it also agrees to go with the U.S. in a Cold War against the Soviet Union. Within 20 years of initial drilling, Venezuela had become the largest oil exporter in the world, and the U.S. was the second largest oil producer. Exports of oil boomed from 1.9 to 91.2% between 1920 and 1935. By the end of the 30s, Venezuela had become the fourth leading oil producer in the world, behind the United States, the Soviet Union, and Mexico, and was the leading exporter nation. From 48 to 58, the Jimenez military dictatorship became increasingly corrupt, and as Batista was doing in Cuba, it alienated more and more of the bourgeois classes in Venezuela. Again, as a result of its insatiable greed to steal everything. Much as Batista had done in Cuba, Jimenez had done the same in Venezuela, minus the mafia of Meyer-Lansky type in Venezuela. At any rate, a revolutionary transition was inevitable, and the Venezuelan bourgeoisie did not want to make a revolution against Jimenez, which featured the Communist Party as an involved factor. So, on the one hand, an attack on Jimenez was going to have to come, but on the other hand, it was not going to be one where the bourgeoisie overthrowing him was going to cooperate in any way with the communists. What happened was that it was the Navy officers who took action against the dictator Jimenez.
who was from the Army. A Navy admiral named Wolfgang Larrazabal, I'm going to use just those two names, there's no point in getting into all of it, overthrew the Jimenez dictatorship at the beginning of 1958 on January 23rd. You recall that Fidel Castro was fighting in the Sierra Maestras at this time, and he radioed from Radio Rebelde his support for Larrazabal, and he sent a mission of 26th of July diplomats immediately to Caracas. Now the latter secured Larrazabal's support for Fidel Castro against Batista, and Larrazabal sent the Fidelistas considerable weaponry as well. Now they'd already, you'll recall, received the previous year a big shipment of weapons from Costa Rica. Jose Figueres, the new president, felt sorry for the Castros, and he wanted to send him as much help as he could, and he did. He filled up a whole plane that was brought back to the Fidelistas, and for the first time they had some decent weapons. Machine guns, mortars, bazookas, ammo for all of this stuff and so on. But now Fidel's got Admiral Larrazabal in Caracas supporting him, and this time Larrazabal starts a steady flight of big planes from Caracas to the mountains of the Sierra Maestras, and these things are just full of very heavy mortars and cannons, heavy machine guns, light machine guns, hundreds of all of these things, millions of bullets, thousands of rifles. I was going to say that the Communist Party in Venezuela between 1960 and 1971 had been largely destroyed by the work of Khrushchev and his revisionists back in Russia, so that the party had split into several different fractions, and for the moment, for the next decade or two, it was going to be relatively impotent. What nobody knew was that Simon Bolivar had been reincarnated, figuratively speaking, on July 28, 1954, because that's when Hugo Chavez was born in the famous state of Barinas. Famous because we talked about the archaeology there earlier and the advanced theocratic chiefdom, famous because of oil. This was just a year after Fidel's assault on the Batista dictatorship in the Moncada barracks. So that was in '53. The following year, Hugo Chavez is born, and by the time Fidel takes power, he's going to be 5 years old, I think, something like that. Well, at the age of 17, Hugo Chavez entered Venezuela's military academy in Caracas, and he had had kind of a rough childhood up until then, but he seemed to get along. He did the best that he could, and they went from high school in the state of Barinas into the military academy, he and his brother, and that was a fairly sophisticated place for the time and place, and a person could get a reasonably good education there in engineering at least, and in military preparation. While he was there, Chavez became friendly at the academy with the son of Panama's president, Omar Torrijos. Some of you may remember that Torrijos got involved in a big struggle with the American presidents over who was going to own the Panama Canal. At any rate, Hugo Chavez was invited to Panama by Torrijos' son, and he got the full indoctrination from the Torrijos family, of course, upon what their position was with regard to the canal. In 1974, Hugo was selected to be one of the Academy's representatives to the celebration in Peru of the Battle of Ayacucho, which we had mentioned just in the last lecture, which Bolivar had liberated at that battle under General Sucre. And President Juan Velasco Alvarado was still president of Peru at this time. He was about to be overthrown in a military coup, and I've talked about that in 3 of my books that deal with Peru in the Idaho Smith series, and because I was there and participated in some aspects of this. If any of you are interested, you could read my book, Shining Path, The Peruvian Revolution, and you can get that in the libraries in some cases, and you can also get it in ebook form from Kindle books. At any rate, I saw what Hugo saw when he arrived in the Peruvian highlands in my journey from Huancayo to Ayacucho. Everywhere there were signs and sayings that Che lives when I got there. It reminded me of stories I'd heard about Zapata lives, that Carlos Prieto and his family told me about how the peasants down in southern Mexico still have this myth that Zapata is going to come down there and liberate them at some point in the future. Well, that's the way the highlands of Peru were at that time. The distance from where Che was killed in Bolivia to Ayacucho, for example, is a very short distance as the crow flies, but in real distance, in terms of up and down mountains and valleys, it's quite a different story altogether. Well, in '75, Hugo Chavez graduated in his military academy, number 8 out of a class of 75, and that put him in the top tier of graduates and the kind of person that the general staff would normally be looking at to work themselves up on the basis of merit. Along the way here, while he was in this process of education, he met a working class girl named Nancy Colmenares, and the two of them got married and they had 3 children. She was Hugo Chavez's first wife. Now, in 1977, Hugo Chavez got the idea of starting a revolutionary movement within the army that would overthrow the government and then move to establish a new kind of government for all of Venezuela. He was transferred out of the academy to a counterinsurgency unit in the oil state of Barinas, and then he was given the task of fighting against a certain group of Venezuelan communist fighters who were Hoxhaist. So that's spelled Hoxhaist, Hoxha, but it's pronounced Hoxha. The Hoxha, he was the leader of the Communist Party in Albania and had become a major international figure because he and Mao Zedong had teamed up together to fight world revisionism. They had a party in Venezuela called the Red Flag Party, and Hugo Chavez and his group were supposed to be fighting them. What actually happened was they found a truck full of Hoxhaist literature, which included selected works of Marx, Lenin, Mao, and other figures from Venezuela's specific history of war for national liberation. And what Hugo Chavez was decided to do now came about in this particular assignment. He was going to create the secret army organization that would have a cell of revolutionary officers and NCOs, and he intended on creating a Simón Bolívar type of army leadership to lead a social revolution like that in Cuba and Peru. Initially, he called this secret army organization the Venezuelan People's Liberation Army, with the initials EPLV in Spanish. Hugo reached out to likely civilian groups and leaders who were mostly Marxist, of course, and included communists like Douglas Bravo and radical cause leader Alfredo Manero. Rumors about these overtures of Hugo Chavez began to reach army intelligence in Venezuela, and Hugo quietly came under surveillance. For this reason, the High Command did not object to his being transferred back to the academy in Caracas, now as a captain and as an instructor, because they wanted to see for themselves what this guy is saying, to whom is he saying it, and exactly what. This time, back at the academy in 1981, after he took up his instructor's position, he started his first cell in 1982, and he called it MBR 200. These are the Spanish initials for Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement. The 200 was his target for the number of members he needed to lead his army. Now you can see that he's learned several things, and one of them is that Cortés conquered all of Mexico with 200 men that he used to officer the Indian armies that he recruited. And he's also learned that Fidel Castro started out with 11 men, had fewer than 200 until the last year of the war, and so those numbers don't sound like much, perhaps, but if you stop and think about it from a Latin American perspective, there's a lesson that these guys have learned here. They figure with 200 men of their dedication and their educational background that they could lead 200 larger cells. At the Academy, for the first time, Hugo got the chance to publicly expound on his version of Simón Bolívar's ideas of nationalism, combined with a smattering of Marxism and Leninism he had picked up over the previous decade. As the great minds of military intelligence had imagined, quote, "Since Hugo loves to talk, let's hear what he has to say," unquote. And so they listened. By 1984, they'd heard enough. Of the Academy graduating class of 133 that year, they knew that at least 30 officers cadets had joined Hugo's secret MBR 200 organization. Hugo was transferred thereafter to the Caracas office of General Rodriguez Ochoa, the idea being to keep an even closer eye on what he was doing. Now these fellows are fairly intelligent, because some secret policemen might have said, let's just pick them all up and lock them up right now. But these guys are saying, no, let's wait until we know everything about him, and then when we pick them up, we'll have everybody. In 1984, Hugo fell in love with a new girl named Irma Marksman, and they had an affair that lasted for several years. Irma taught history and was a good intellectual companion, and soon a comrade. Hugo explained his ideas about revolution in the army. She explained history from a sophisticated Marxist-Leninist perspective to him. This relationship did not interfere with his marriage and his family life with Nancy at the time. You'll recall we talked about the Boricazo in 1948-49. Well, now they're going to have the Caracazo of February 27, 89. Hugo's political and economic education was accelerated when Venezuela President Carlos Andrés Pérez launched an attack on the poverty-stricken masses of the capital city known as Caracazo. That is the big event in Caracas. On February 27, 1989, thousands of people died, thousands more were wounded as the secret police and select army units attacked the people of Caracas' poorer barrios. Carlos Andrés Pérez was an early Obama in that in 1988 he ran for president as the Democratic Action candidate on a left program, but once in office he did exactly the opposite, running against the International Monetary Fund and its compradors, capitalists in Venezuela. Andrés Pérez kept the presidency for Democratic Action in 1988, but when he was in power he immediately turned the country over to the most reactionary classes and invited in the International Monetary Fund and all of its repressive anti-people austerity programs. Austerity was for the people, and then as now it meant massive handouts to banks and big corporations. Hugo had learned the lesson of what social democracy and power really means in the contemporary world, and during this crackdown known as the Caracazo, Hugo had missed it because he was hospitalized with chickenpox. But he did see it on television, and what this convinced him to do, and this is in 1988, this convinced him to make, the time had come to make the move for power. So in 1992, Hugo Chavez made his first attempt to seize state power in a military coup. Along with unaffiliated Venezuelan communist Douglas Bravo and a corps of officer cadets, Hugo Chavez made an attempt to seize state power by military coup in 1992. Now this military action, occurred on February 24, 1992, and he called it Operation Zamora. In the early twilight hours of February 1992, 5 army units under Chavez's command moved into urban Caracas with the mission of overwhelming key military and communication installations, including the Miraflores Presidential Palace, the Defense Ministry, La Calata Military Airport, and the Military Museum. The most important target to be captured was the IMF flunky and national traitor President Carlos Andrés Pérez, who was returning that night to Caracas from another foreign trip where he was selling out Venezuela to the world bankers. What happened was that the insurgents let themselves get contained in the military museum and lost communication with their network of spies and underground cells long enough for the government to mount a counterattack. The rebels could not broadcast their call for a national uprising of their supporters and the masses, therefore, and Chavez only had the loyalty of about 10% of the armed forces. This was not enough to do the job without the cells of the anti-imperialist resistance. So President Pérez escaped and the rebels lost 143 men. The government lost 64 dead and wounded. It was as close a replay to Cuba's Moncada barracks attempts by Fidel Castro as was possible, and the same long-term results. The rebels were forced to surrender, but only after the government allowed Chavez to appear on national television in uniform to explain himself. Of course, he called for the revolution to be successful in the future, and then he walked into captivity at San Carlos prison. The Venezuelan nation was shocked. It was the first time that the entire Venezuelan people got to see the man who would soon become their most famous leader since Simón Bolívar. While he was inside, other army men made a second coup attempt in November '92, but it also was suppressed. And Hugo suffered serious blows to his domestic life when his wife divorced him, and politically and personally in '93. Failure, he learned, can take a man from being a hero to a zero rather quickly. However, impeachment proceedings began in '93 against Andrés Pérez, and he was forced to leave office by the end of August of '93. The Senate appointed a caretaker named Octavio Lepage as acting president and replaced him with Ramon Jose Velázquez 3 months later to fill out that term ending in '94. In the '93 election, Rafael Caldero won the presidency for AD, and he freed Hugo Chavez the following year. Upon release, Hugo Chavez announced that the revolution could and would be won at the ballot box. So this was a big shift. The Chavista movement split into several factions, but for our purposes, we're following the thread of Hugo Chavez. Hugo announced the Movement for the Fifth Republic, MVR, and the MVR had a strong socialist program and featured a reborn Venezuelan Communist Party as a member. His appeal, Chavez's appeal to the masses of dispossessed and oppressed people of Venezuela and to the progressive intellectuals, was backed up by the communist participation. His campaign for president would succeed in 1998 when he gathered 56.2% of the vote, what would be called a landslide victory in any North American presidential election. In the presidential elections of 1998, the Venezuelan Communist Party backed Hugo Chavez, adding 82,000 votes, or 1.25% of the national vote, to Chavez's total of 3.7 million votes. In the 2006 election, the PZV ticket, that is the communist ticket, received 2.9% of the national vote, contributing 342,000 to Chavez's total of 7.3 million votes. These results made the PCV the fourth largest party in the Chavez coalition. In the presidential elections 2 years ago, in 2012, the Venezuelan Communist Party again backed Chavez. Its ticket contributed 3.28% of the national vote, making PCV the second largest party in the Chavez coalition. So as you can see, they've been gradually gaining strength. The PCV won 1.6% in the 2013 municipal elections, which was up from 1.4% in the 2008 municipal elections. And the PCV articulated its belief that transition to socialism in Venezuela will be slow and evolutionary. Now, that in itself is a serious problem for them theoretically. And as we see the Maduro regime now bogging down and trying to decide what they're going to do next, this is where the Venezuelan Communist Party should be taking a strong line on nationalizing all of the big capitalists in the country. But we'll have to wait and see what they decide to do. At any rate, after the 2005 legislative midterm elections, 8 PCV members were elected as deputies to the National Assembly. So, the seizure of state power is over as far as the progressive forces in Venezuela are concerned, but the revolution has just begun, and we have yet to find out what is going to happen now. Will the Venezuelan communists be able to press the Maduro government to go all the way and eliminate the big capitalists of Venezuela, and of course behind them the U.S. imperialists, or not? I have no prediction to make here. Venezuela, I think, will just have to watch and observe what happens there. And I have no particular predilection toward any one side, so I'm not sure what course I would recommend if I was in Venezuela. but I'm not. My job here is to provide you with the data you need so you can understand what's going on inside Venezuela right now. Now the next topic we're going to take up, the next lecture topic we're going to take up is going to be the Guianas. And I'll just start here with a few comments about that because I think we're probably going to start that on a different disc. The Guianas are that area of northeast South America that borders directly on Venezuela. And there are three of them: British Guiana, which is now just called Guyana, French Guiana, and Dutch Guiana. The French still use theirs as a pretty active spot for their missile development program, and of course, you know, for many years it was famous as a prison down there, where some of our greatest prison escape books have been written about that place. The Dutch, last time I was there, the biggest business in Suriname was the drug business. Of course, that was quite a long time ago, so I'm not sure what the situation is like today. But the Guianas we're going to treat next time primarily with our focus on British Guiana because, first of all, it's the biggest. And secondly, it's where most of the political action occurred, which led up to the fight for communism in the Guianas. And it also borders on a Venezuelan state of the same name. And the history of these two areas is so intimately interlinked, I decided to move from our discussion of the Venezuelan Revolution and fight for communism to the struggle, the fight which occurred in the Guianas. The interesting part in British Guiana is that a communist won the elections early on there, and he and his wife, his name was Chetty Jagan, he and his wife, an American Jewish girl, I believe from Chicago, became the president and first lady of this country. Chetty Jagan died in office. The imperialists tried many times to get rid of him, going way back into the early 1950s, and were unsuccessful. Janet Jagan was an MD who also got a wide reputation as a humanitarian. She was elected president in her own right after her husband died, and she was a communist all of her life. So one could say that the fight for communism in Guyana, British Guiana, is about the same as the life history of Chetty and Janet Jagan, and we're going to take a look at that in the next lecture. After that, we're going to go to Peru and Bolivia and talk about those two areas. And for now, that's going to be it.